Starting it now.
There we go. Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Geospatial Forum today on a day with lots of geospatial related incidents in the world. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Adam Turando. I'm in the applied ecology department at NC State here, and but also I'm with the US Geological Survey with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and that's why I'm introducing my colleague and friend today, Dr. Brian Miller, who will be talking to us about scenarios. Dr. Brian Miller is a research ecologist with the USGS North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and Brian's going to tell you more about the CASC network if you're not familiar with it, so I won't steal his thunder on that. Brian's current focus is on using scenario planning and simulation modeling to support natural resource management in the Rocky Mountains and the Northern Great Plains. He is also a co-organizer of the Indigenous Phenology Network and an instructor with the National Conservation Training Center, which is a really cool facility up in West Virginia. He has an interdisciplinary background in social ecological systems and has used a broad range of methods, including simulation modeling, fluvial geomorphology, institutional and livelihood decision analysis, and remote sensing to examine the interactions of climate, ecosystems, and resource management all around the world, places like East Africa, the Galapagos Islands, and the Western US. Brian earned his BA in ecology and evolutionary biology from CU Boulder, and his PhD from down the road at UNC, where I confirmed he is not a Duke fan, so at least he has that going for him. And at his committee, his committee in Chapel Hill recognized some of the names. His advisors, Paul Leslie in anthropology, and any of you know Aaron Moody, he was on his committee as well. And Brian's been with us at USGS first as a postdoc in 2013, and he joined our network as a research ecologist in 2016. Brian lives in Fort Collins, and he's a Wisconsinite by birth. He's a fan of the Tar Heels, apparently. He can talk more about that later. And I can also confirm, Brian and I compared notes, and we can confirm he has the best hair in the CASC network. So with that, done enough embarrassing him. Go ahead and take it away, Brian.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate that compliment. I'm glad that was recorded for posterity. I'll be sure to extract that clip and share it with our network. Well, hey, yeah, thanks so much for the intro and hosting, and big thanks to John too, who has been doing all the legwork, as far as I know, to rope me into this and do the planning and the administrative stuff that's crucial to putting these things on. So big thanks to John for coordinating and making it happen. And then thanks to all for joining today. I really appreciate this chance to talk with you all. My only regret is that I'm not there in person, but that's the world we live in these days. So anyway, just glad to be here remotely, and yeah, I hope maybe it leads to an in-person conversation someday in the future. All right, so let me jump in here, see if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. So I'm gonna spend probably not the whole hour here. I wanna leave plenty of time for questions, but maybe 40 minutes or something. Going over this sort of rough structure. I decided to include a bit of background, which Adam touched on in the intro there, sort of where I come from academically. I think both because I think that it may pique your interest just in terms of the geography and methods that I was using. Maybe there's some overlap there and things we might want to talk about. But also it gives you some context for how I approach my more recent work. And that's where I'll spend the bulk of my time today, is talking about that recent work with the CASCs that, again, I'll talk about a little more later on. And I'm structuring that part of the talk around an analytical framework, which sort of used as an organizing structure for a series of subsequent case studies out here in the Western US. So I'm gonna, and then I'll briefly, just really on a slide or two, I'll touch on some of my ongoing work and wrap up. But admittedly, I'm gonna cover a fair amount of ground, so I'm gonna move through stuff pretty quickly. And the idea there is just to give you sort of a sampler, a flavor for the kind of work that I do, throw in some pretty pictures as well. So it'll be sort of broad but shallow, and with the hope that, again, we may find some points of mutual interest, and who knows, maybe collaborations into the future. As far as questions go, I know we have the chat feature. You can drop stuff in there. And I've asked John if there's like a clarification question, if I use an acronym or something that's not familiar, to feel free and just jump in and interrupt me. I'm happy to clarify. If there's something more substantive, maybe we'll hold those to the end and we can have a little bit larger conversation around those. All right, so a bit of background on sort of who I am professionally. As Adam mentioned, and I know this is risky so early in the talk to put up a slide of UNC, but I'll just get it on the table. I went to grad school down the road there at Chapel Hill, and I earned my degree in ecology from their ecology degree program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And for those that aren't, it's an interdisciplinary degree program. And again, as Adam mentioned, my committee was from a variety of departments, and my advisor is an anthropologist. So really, my training was in a blend of social science and ecology. And early in my stint there at UNC, I worked with a fellow student and my advisor to do a literature review that we later published, looking at how research really captures these feedbacks between conservation initiatives and social ecological systems. In essence, what we found is that although there's plenty of work on how conservation initiatives impact people, that black arrow, I shouldn't say plenty, there is a substantial component of work on that. And also conversely on how people impact the environment, that gray arrow at the bottom. There's less known about how those two things are related, how the social impacts of conservation actually translate into carry-on environmental impacts. In other words, those feedbacks between conservation initiatives and those social ecological systems. So this provided sort of the conceptual underpinnings, or I guess theoretical kind of motivation for my dissertation work in East Africa. And I'm sure you all are familiar with these landscapes, either sort of personally, maybe professionally, maybe been there, maybe you've just seen these places on TV, but of course they're sort of well known for their wildlife and iconic landscapes. And as a result of that, they've grown this really considerable tourism industry, right? And so right there, we already have sort of this interesting interplay and social. From the thing I was interested in is sort of that combined with the ongoing challenges faced by Maasai livestock pastoralists who are making a living in this resources has changed dramatically because of conservation, of land use change and other things. And so for my dissertation work, I was focusing specifically on how pastoralists in northern Tanzania access drought resource areas, how that access has changed, how they responded in terms of their livelihoods and also their management institutions, and thus how they've impacted river systems in particular. And so the last slide on this, substantive chapters of my dissertation, looking first at geospatial analysis of how drought resource areas are distributed in East Africa relative to land use change and conservation. Secondly, looking at how pastures themselves have really responded to changes in that resource access. And then finally, how their management institutions and rivers have been impacted by those livelihood decisions. So again, just a flavor for, I guess what I'll think of, or sort of think of as my past life doing this work in East Africa. Since finishing turned my attention geographically to the Western US, and then topically more toward issues of climate change and natural resource management. But this still kind of informs the way I approach things now. So then in 2016, I became a federal scientist with US Geological Survey. So in some ways I relate to this, this quote from Elton. But in particular, I work for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CASC, North Central, the NC CASC in this case. And that may get confusing in North Carolina, where NC is usually reserved for your state. But so I'm professionally affiliated with CU Boulder. That's our host institution for our CASC, sort of that teal collection of states there in the upper middle part of the United States. And of course, your local CASC that Adam is a part of is right there at NC State. And maybe y'all are familiar with it. If not, you can bug Adam. But yeah, we have 9 regional centers, and we also have a headquarters office in Reston, Virginia. And really the intent of these CASCs is to have a partnership with universities, NGOs, tribal institutions that brings together scientists and natural and cultural resource managers to help resource managers adapt to a changing climate. So we provide the science to facilitate that. And that looks a little bit different depending on the region, depending on the partners. And I'll just talk about, sort of from my perspective, the work that I've been doing in our region. And largely that work for me has been with the National Park Service, as you'll see here shortly. And of course, sort of the motivation work is front and center, and oftentimes in the popular media, the news media, climate change is sort of no longer this abstract thing that's in the future. It's here, it's now. We're seeing its fingerprint on extreme events. Here's just a handful of examples of events from just last year out here in the West. And I'm sure there are many there in the southeastern US that you can think of. But it's this prescient issue, and increasingly managers want to respond to it, prepare for future changes. And really, I think part of our job is to help them grapple with those changes, particularly in light of the uncertainty of future change. Although there's broad agreement, we'll see more warming. Exactly how much and what type is not always clear, especially from a global standpoint. And then when we look sort of further downstream at ecological impacts, there's even more complexity and uncertainty in terms of the ways in which ecosystems might respond, even to any one particular climate feature. Because of course, ecosystems are influenced by these multi-scale phenomena from individual species level physiological responses up through community assembly dynamics, and then sort of system level thresholds and feedback. So lots of things at play that might influence the ways in which climate change might manifest in a case in a given landscape at a particular time. So it's a big challenge, right? And of course, no one tool is going to allow us to sort of crack the nut and solve this problem of predicting how climate will affect our natural and cultural resources. And so back in 2014, my colleague, and at the time the director of the North Central CASC, Jeff Morissette, and I put together this analytical framework. And the idea being that could we come up with essentially a workflow for combining multiple tools to grapple with this challenge of climate change adaptation. And of course, like this, this isn't comprehensive or exhaustive. It doesn't include all of the tools we might use. These are just sort of our favorites that I'm most familiar with. But this framework has sort of served, at least for me, as a structure for actually working on the ground climate change adaptation. And so I'm going to talk about a series of case studies that entailed research and development in order to actually create the linkages you see here, these arrows with the different letters and create essentially the infrastructure for doing this sort of combined analysis. And so that's the focus of the talk. I'll keep kind of returning to this analytical framework throughout the talk, so I'm not going to like go through and unpack it all now. I'm going to do it more in a piecemeal fashion through these case studies, and hopefully it'll become sort of crystal clear by the time we're done. So the first project that I'll talk about was an effort to improve the rigor of our scenario planning, both through the use of downscaled climate data, but also through ecological response modeling. And this focused on 2 National Park Service units and the areas around them in North Dakota and South Dakota. North Dakota was Knife River Indian Villages National Historic Site, and in South Dakota, we were focused on landscapes centered on Badlands National Park. And so, as I just mentioned, this is really about combining scenario planning, sort of the big blob on the left side of the screen there, with informing it with climate science, climate data, and then also ecological response modeling. So I'm going to kind of talk about those different components, giving a bit of background on each, and talk about sort of the implications for those parks we were working with. So I first, sort of as context for that, wanted to just briefly revisit this idea of uncertainty that I talked about before. And before, I showed you a very similar graphic of global mean temperature change. And here I'm just showing, that even for sort of downscaled and locally bias corrected climate data, we still have the challenge confronting us of substantial uncertainty in climate change going forward in time. So, the amount of warming we might see for a specific place is uncertain. And when we look at other variables like mean annual precipitation, in some parts of the world, we can't say confidently which direction it might change, let alone the magnitude. And so right here, if you put on sort of the hat of a resource manager who's responsible for, say, managing bison at Badlands, it's sort of unclear what you're supposed to do with this kind of information. But okay, even if I accept that climate change is a problem, what am I supposed to do about it given this amount of uncertainty? And I think that's nicely captured here by this Gary Larson cartoon. Yeah, because the managers, they are making decisions every day. They're making longer term plans to meet their goals. And so how can they really sort of prepare for change? And one tool we have to assist with that is called scenario planning. And I think we're all sort of intuitively familiar with scenario planning. We make decisions under uncertainty all the time, whether it's financial decisions or decisions about renting or buying or selling a house, when you retire, or something maybe a little bit more trivial, like bringing an umbrella to work, whether or not you should. I think internally, we're pretty good at thinking about the different possible situations we could face, and thus kind of gaming out, well, if I make this decision, how well am I going to do? How well positioned am I going to be to succeed if the world turns out like, in this scenario versus this other one? And in a way, that's really what scenario planning is at its heart. And of course, it's been formalized and applied in a lot of different ways. I think early on through the military and still to this day. And then it was popularized really by Royal Dutch Shell in their efforts to prepare for shocks in the oil market. And it's been used in other private sector applications. More recently, it's been used with effect in Fish and Wildlife Service and also the National Park Service. And I'll talk about those National Park Service examples. So I'll be giving you kind of a flavor of scenario planning, but recognize that I'm not sort of giving you the way to do scenario planning. It's just a way. But I think for any of these applications, it's true that it's meant to support decisions under conditions that are uncertain and uncontrollable. And that's really highly appropriate for something like climate change, where as I've shown, there's lots of uncertainty, and much of it is beyond our control, at least as individuals. And this stands really in stark contrast to a more forecast-based approach, where you might say, hey, here's the future we expect. Let's plan for that, as is shown sort of there on the lower left. And rather saying, what's the broadest plausible range of conditions we could face, and let's plan around those and set ourselves up such that any decision we make now will be robust to that uncertainty. So how do we actually do this? Well, in our case, we really start with the management concerns of our partners. So we start by identifying what we call focal resources, which are just those things that a manager cares the most about at their park service unit or their fish and wildlife service unit or whatever it might be. So, you know, when you look at a place like Badlands National Park, and here's just a few images to give you an idea of the landscape and the resources there. We could sort of boil down their diversity of resources to a smaller set based on, you know, what managers say is their priority, but also through things like their founding documents and things like that. And so, you know, in essence, and this is a bit of a simplification, but we could say, okay, Badlands focal resources are the grasslands and the grazers they support, like bison. It's infrastructure, because tourists come there to see this landscape, and it's a highly erosive landscape. So roads and so on are a big deal. There's also paleontological and archaeological resources and threatened and endangered species like the black-footed ferret. So these are sort of our focal resources. And our next task then is to say, okay, well, given that these are the things that a manager cares about, what are the aspects of climate that affect those resources? What are the critical uncertainties that we need to consider when we develop scenarios? So again, going back to our little focal resource list here, we could say, okay, well, there's a couple of things, a handful of features of the climate that are the drivers of change in these focal resources. And for things like, especially, you know, grasslands and grazing, production in any given year is really dictated by spring precipitation and when spring begins. You know, heavy precip events are, of course, really important for infrastructure and paleontological and archaeological resources. So you can start to draw these connections between the resources and climate. And our next task then is to say, okay, so we've got this set of climate metrics that we care about. What's the broadest plausible range of conditions we could face in those particular metrics? So in some exercises, this can be a qualitative sort of assessment. You might say, well, we could get a lot more spring precipitation, or, you know, we might get less. In our case, we wanted to really ground that range of uncertainty in the climate data that we have at our disposal. So we use downscaled climate data to identify really specifically what are the ranges in those variables. And I'm actually using some variables from a different application just because it was a bit of a prettier figure, but the same concept applies for our Badlands work. So here what I'm going to show you is a scatter plot where the x-axis is change in extreme precip events, the y-axis is change in hot days, or at least for this part of the world, these are hot days. I don't know, North Carolina, you might not think that's quite as hot, but then we sort of populate this plot with individual points, and each point is the projection from an individual global climate model run for a particular emissions pathway. And so you can see here's the spread of dots around the space. And our job then is to pick a small subset of those so that we have sort of a tractable, manageable set of futures that we can use to further build out our scenarios. And so I've circled here the 4 what we call climate futures that we selected for this project to represent divergence in these variables. But importantly, we don't just do it for 2 variables. We're often doing this across multiple dimensions of climate. And so we select these, you know, generally 3 to 5 climate futures and summarize them. If you're curious to learn more about this process of selecting climate futures and how it compares to other approaches like an RCP-based approach, Dave Lawrence led a paper that I think nicely summarizes that. So, and if you don't scribble this down in time, you can always ping me or look up in the chat and I can share the link. But so we take our climate futures and we summarize the data for those in a bunch of different ways. Because the next step is to share this then with our management partners and local subject matter experts who are going to help us turn this climate data into actual scenarios. And that's the next step in our process. So now we're finally at the point of developing scenarios in earnest. And what are scenarios? Well, in essence, they're stories. They're stories about how the world could turn out. And in this case, they're grounded in climate data. And importantly, these aren't just stories just for the sake of having them, but we use them to prepare managers for future change. And I'll show you what I mean here in a moment. So this is where we usually, or I guess used to, convene in-person workshops, as I said, with managers and subject matter experts and other scientists who sit down and say, okay, well, if this is what happens in terms of climate change under this particular climate future, here's the set of conditions we'd face. Let's game out what would happen to grassland productivity and thus to bison. How would it affect roads and infrastructure? And really tell the story of how resources would respond to those climatic changes. And the reason that we're doing that is to then use those scenarios as a test bed to look at our management strategies, or excuse me, the partners' management strategies, and ask themselves, are we likely to succeed if the world turns out like this? Or what do we need to change about our goals or about our activities in order to be successful? And I like to think of this step as sort of you use this analogy of wind tunneling, where you could think of a management strategy as a model airplane. And you want to test that model airplane under different conditions before you build the full scale thing and pack it full of people and put it up in the air. And so in this case, you might say, okay, our strategy, let's say, is to maintain a cold water fishery. And perhaps you do that as a manager through annual stocking of that fish species, right? And historically, this has worked really well. And so you'd want to say, all right, well, let's look at our different scenarios and see if we'd still succeed. So maybe we've got a warm and wet scenario. Maybe there's a scenario that's more of a variable kind of climate, and then maybe more of a hotter or drier climate. Is your strategy going to work under all of those? And if it's not, what do you need to change to be successful? Do you need to do more frequent stocking of that fish? Do you need to do stream shading? Maybe you need to revisit your goal entirely and say, look, under one or more of these scenarios, we couldn't maintain a cold water fishery. Maybe if we want any fishery at all, we should bring in a warm water species. Those are tough decisions, but this is meant to be sort of a space for managers to think proactively about those kinds of things. And ultimately, really refine their strategies. And that's sort of that last step, and often it's iterative, but a chance to sort of revisit their management approaches. And there's more and more interest in using scenario planning for climate adaptation. But we have to recognize really two things. One, managers often need or want more quantitative information. The storylines are great for getting people invested and really understanding things deeply, but they often ask for quantitative info. And we've got to recognize, there's limits to our brain power. We're pretty smart people, but we have tools, computers, at our disposal to expand our analytical capacity and really start to unpack the interactions between climate and ecology and management activities. And so for this work with Badlands, we developed a type of ecological simulation model called a state and transition simulation to project vegetation changes on the landscape. And I won't have time really to dig much into how these simulations work. There's a great pub by Paul and Daniel that's there at the bottom of the slide that gets into some more detail about these, but these are stochastic, often spatial simulations, and they're quite flexible in terms of the types of vegetation they can represent. This is sort of a simple three-state class diagram here in this slide with three generic types of vegetation, but you can make them sort of as specific as you like. And then really the beauty of these is that the transitions, those arrows that could change vegetation between states, are also quite flexible and can include things like succession, fire, restoration, grazing. And essentially what the model does then is tracks those changes in vegetation over time. and it can, again, do so spatially. So we developed a simulation of vegetation production and composition for our landscape. And what we could do then is say, okay, well, let's layer on top of that the 4 climate features we talked about in our workshop and some of the management activities that managers talked about as being potential adaptations. And so we could put together these different drivers of change and look at how vegetation responded to different grazing rates, different prescribed fire regimes, different methods of invasive species inventory and treatment. And we sort of summed this up in a glossy sort of 4 or 5 page resource brief. And if you Google NPS scenario showcase, I think you could probably dig around and find your way to it, or I'd be happy to share it later. But I kind of summed up that combination of participatory scenario planning and also more quantitative ecological modeling. I wanted to talk about sort of an extension of this project, again, so bison related, that was really honed in on the modeling component of the work, where we wanted to extend our analytical capacity of those simulations to include the dynamics of wildlife. So I mentioned state and transition simulations before in this model that we developed for Badlands. And one thing we recognized after the fact really was that the limitation of that approach is that it doesn't really represent very well the nuances of wildlife movement or decisions or interactions with their habitat. And that's really the strength of another modeling approach called agent-based modeling, which you may be familiar with. For those that aren't, it's in essence, an agent-based model has 3 components. It has agents, some sort of environment, and then rules that dictate how the agents and the environment interact with each other. And agents are quite flexible. It's really any kind of autonomous unit you can think of. So it could be a person, bison, cattle, it could be a virus moving around in a simulated environment and interacting with it. And the strength of agent-based models is that they can represent various characteristics of these agents. So you can make agents mobile. They can make movement decisions individually based on what they see in the world around them. The agents can adapt to changes in their environment. They can even learn from past experience or interact with one another. So you get some really, really neat ways to kind of represent complexities, in this case of say, wildlife movement. And so what we decided to do was to link an agent-based model with our existing state and transition simulation. So we'd have dynamic vegetation through that state and transition simulation and dynamic agents through this agent-based model, where we have little bison moving around the landscape. And in our case, we did this through R. So R gave us that mechanism to pass information dynamically between these 2 software programs, SynchroSim and NetLogo. And actually we've, since this time, we've developed the capacity to do much of this work within SynchroSim itself, a little bit friendlier modeling environment if you're not a programmer or you're not very familiar with R. But needless to say, so we initially developed it through our programming language. But the reason that we did this and why we think it's useful is that it expanded our analytical capacity. We could represent things happening at multiple temporal scales, from hourly bison movement decisions up through seasonal and annual vegetation dynamics. And this allowed us to minimize assumptions about where we thought bison might graze and when. And importantly, and this is what's shown here at the bottom in this map, these are maps of our study area that show the distribution of grazing. So our state and transition simulation model outputs are here on the left, at the bottom left. These are essentially what I'm showing is that grazing events were spatially random in that state and transition simulation output. But if you look at the agent-based model and the coupled model output, it's much more realistic in that the grazing events are clustered around water sources, as you might expect. Importantly, there were some differences between those. They look very similar by themselves, but there were some important differences that reflect feedbacks between a dynamic environment, dynamic vegetation, and dynamic agents, those bison moving around the landscape. Okay. So shifting gears to another system here, we're not talking about bison anymore. we're talking about whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And this is another sort of modeling focused enterprise where in this case, we were really interested in improving the rigor by which we incorporate climate data, climate science into our simulations. And we did so through species distribution modeling because we recognize that our simulations down here, we had some ways to incorporate climate, but often those relied on established empirical relationships between, say, vegetation production and climate. But we have another means of incorporating climate effects, and that is through species distribution models. You may be familiar with these, and probably you may even know a lot more about them than I do, but these are a commonly used tool for estimating species response to climate change. And in essence, they use statistical algorithms to relate where we don't see a species and the environmental and climatic covariates associated with those locations. But then say, okay, well, where is the most suitable habitat now and historically, and looking forward in time. So these are just maps of whitebark pine habitat suitability for different time periods and different emissions pathways. And the warm colors are more suitable habitat. The blue colors are less suitable. So you can kind of see this decline in habitat suitability through time for that particular species. And that can be informative, but they don't really project species distributions per se. And that's because they're not including ecological dynamics like disturbance or management activities or competition between species that really dictate where you actually find a species on the landscape. And of course, we realize, well, that's the strength, sort of the beauty of these other kinds of simulations that we use. They can include things like succession and disturbance and disease and competition. And what they're lacking is what the species distribution models have. And so what we did for a portion of this simulation is we essentially ingested the species distribution model output. We could use these maps of habitat suitability to dictate the likelihood that, in this case, a whitebark pine seed would turn into a seedling. And we could vary these probabilities over space and over time. I'm going to talk really quickly in one slide, 2 slides, about one more case study that was led by Shannon McNeely and Tyler Beaton, other folks at North Central Pask. This was work that acknowledged that social science, of course, has an important role to play. In our case, we were focused on how it can improve and enhance simulation models, but we recognize that it has plenty of other sort of standalone value and value in improving our other methods too. But here I'm just focusing on the simulation modeling piece. And really, the work that they led really laid out ways in which we can use qualitative social science to inform our modeling. It can help us prioritize model components, what we include, how we frame scenarios, how we even parameterize and evaluate model performance. And so again, just a brief sort of nod to that domain of research. And now, I'm going to kind of close out this case study segment by looking across these and some other related projects at how we've been able to integrate this science into planning and into decision making. So, I think like a lot of work that you all do, we produce pubs and reports and stuff. Just part of what we do as scientists, and that's great and it's important. But across across this period of research and development, we found that some of these tools can really facilitate some open-minded thinking about divergent scenarios. And in some cases, quantitative modeling has helped to improve that understanding and that work. But despite that, and even despite really close collaboration between scientists and our management partners, how best to sort of, actually facilitate climate change adaptation hasn't always been clear, unless we've really tied our work really closely to an existing ongoing resource management planning process. And for Park Service, that has been what they call resource stewardship strategies. These are long-range tools that that Park Service units around the country are developing that guide their staffing, their budget decisions, And so we realized that if we could partner with the planning arm of Park Service and coordinate with them such that we could do our work in conjunction with the development of RSSs for a given park unit, we could sort of get that work in on the ground level of them making their decisions and plans. And this has led to some concrete management outcomes. This is an image from Devil's Tower National Monument. It's hard to see probably for y'all, but in the background of this slide, there's some built infrastructure around what is a spring. What the park had been planning to do prior to our engagement is to remove that infrastructure and restore some natural conditions. But what they realized through the scenario planning work was that that infrastructure could be really important under a hotter, drier future for maintaining surface water for wildlife and for native vegetation. Similarly, at Wind Cave National Park, we found that there was likely to be a reduced stream flow regardless of the climate future, even under the wettest climate future, because of increased evapotranspiration. And so that sort of cemented their resolve to ensure adequate surface water for bison and other wildlife by improving their water retaining structures. Again, back at Devil's Tower, one thing they recognize is that they have seen, or likely to continue to see, a decline in their riparian forests. And so they're developing a long-term riparian management plan that may include managed relocation of new species. That's a big decision and a big deal to bring in other species that haven't been there historically. At Knife River, where there's a lot of really important cultural and archaeological sites, they had decided to prioritize sites for protection and excavation so that they could avoid the more reactionary kind of salvage operations that would be required under future scenarios that might entail more flooding and more extreme precip events. And then, lastly, last example here is at Badlands. They recognized through this work that, by having lower densities of animals, ensured forage during dry years, it makes sense. Fewer animals, you got more grass available for those drought years. But this had a trade-off. It was undermining their goal of maintaining a diverse native prairie because it allowed the expansion of cool season exotic grasses. So they're reevaluating their bison herd size. And all these findings are now incorporated into their plans, their resource management plans. And these findings and sort of our lessons learned in terms of applying scenario planning is laid out in a recent pub in Conservation Science and Practice, if you want to dig a little bit more into the scenario planning world and the stuff we've been doing. So just a few more slides here and I'll be done talking at you. Just wanted to mention a few ongoing projects in case it piques your interest. We're now looking at domestic grazers in national park units, and Dinosaur National Monument in particular is who we're working with right now, but I believe there's something like 94 Park Service units around the country that have domestic grazers on their land, and they develop management plans for those. So we're working on that. Also working with the Mountain Ute tribe in Southwest Colorado to not only bring in scenario planning and paleoecology, but also their traditional knowledge to facilitate their climate change adaptation. And then we're also developing sort of a new kind of combo of tools, which is with scenario planning and structured decision making, a decision analytic approach that you all might use or be familiar with. So last slide to wrap up. I think the key takeaway for me from this experience has been that we've got a bunch of scientific tools at our disposal that are good at dealing with different parts of this climate change challenge. And to the degree that we can really integrate them more seamlessly, I think that we'll more effectively be able to grapple with this challenge, because I think having multiple tools that can be used in concert, sort of greater than the sum of its parts, if you will. And I guess it goes beyond that. It's not just about putting tools together, but we also need to bring people together. A big part of this job is to convene and coordinate scientists, managers, subject matter experts to make this happen. So yeah, I think with that, I'll stop talking and welcome you to reach out to me directly if you want to follow up or ask any questions or have a chat. And I think we've got some time here, maybe 15 minutes or so to have some questions and conversation. I'll pull up the chat too, just to see what we've got there. Let me stop sharing my screen for a moment so I can maybe see folks.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, sure thing.
And so, John, I don't know if you're handling Q&A or remind me how we're doing that. Otherwise, I can.
Folks can unmute themselves and ask questions, or also put them in the chat. If you do put them in the chat, let's just be sure to read them out loud for everyone.
Okay. Well,
and some familiar names here, Josh being one of them.
Well, I was going to start with a question, Brian.
Yeah, sure.
So great talk. Thank you very much. I know you are in the north central region, so it's like the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains, but just from a broader park system perspective, from your knowledge, what would you say right now is sort of the biggest stakes decision that you're aware of that the Park Service is considering in terms of like developing a strategy in response to climate change? Like it can be reactive or maybe even more interesting and be thinking about a forward looking strategy that's under consideration. Is it like, is it related to cultural resources? Is it like dry tortugas, going underwater? Are they gonna do geoengineering with Volcanoes National Park and try to cool the climate off? What are some of the bigger stakes strategies that are under consideration right now?
Yeah, and you may have some answers of your own here, but and there's a couple things that I've been hearing a lot about from Park Service collaborators. One is infrastructure. They've in part because they've got a pretty substantial glut of funding now to apply to this backlog of infrastructure maintenance and development. And so they're trying to figure out ways to do that in a way that's climate smart. So that it's not just like, oh, let's just fix the road the way it's always been. Like maybe we need to put that road in a completely new place. And so I know there's a lot of conversation going on around that. And then I think I'll just, this isn't as specific as maybe some of the examples that you gave, but maybe something a little more overarching is this notion of applying what's called the resist, accept, direct framework that you know about, Adam, and I think others in the audience probably have heard about, but it's sort of this emerging framework for thinking about management decisions and preparing for climate change. You can, in some cases, yeah, it makes sense to keep resisting climate change and say keep planting those trees wherever you've been planting them, or keep this species out. In other cases, you have to realize like those resistance strategies may not work anymore, or you're just throwing money at a problem that's never going to go away. And so maybe you need to accept some changes that are coming down the pipe. Or maybe you even want to think about directing change proactively so that you can achieve a more desirable end state than you might just get from being sort of passive and letting things occur. And so the application of those decisions, I mean, it happens at different scales, at different parks in different ways. You got a place like Dry Tortuga, I don't like, I think maybe their only choice is to resist, but I don't know, like, I'm not really familiar with that particular example, but if you've got a park that will like disappear because of sea level rise, I guess you could accept it and just give up on the park, but I assume that they're going to resist it as much as possible. In other cases, like at that Devil's Tower example, they're thinking about assisted migration of species, which is directing change. And that's, that I think the assisted migration of species is also a big one for the parks are grappling with. It's like, when do you pull the trigger on that? And may or may not be reversible, and it's a big deal. So anyway, I don't have a particular park or something to point to, but those are the big issues that I see.
Cool, thanks. Any other questions?
Hey, Brian, I had a quick question here. So we talked a lot about the idea of going sort of back and forth between the science and the managers to use the models and the results of your studies to really create actionable change. How iterative is that process? Meaning, sort of as we get closer to whatever that predicted time was, and hypothetically the forecasts become clearer and clearer, is it a process where as you become more familiar with what the actual range of results might be, that it becomes a more iterative process with managers?
Yeah, I guess maybe there's sort of two ways that I think about that question, and thanks for that question. So I think that the science we do, and of course Adam could speak to this too, there's a whole range of of levels of engagement with partners, and I think across that range you could still end up with actionable science, so to speak, right? Like some science is a matter of, say, going off and developing climate information and then handing it off to a manager because maybe they're really savvy, or it's a problem where they just need a particular kind of information, and then they can make a choice. And that's not really co-production per se, and that's okay. You're not working super closely with the manager necessarily, but it could still be, you could produce some actionable science. In other cases, like the work that I was showing, it's much more like, it's very iterative. Like we're, like for instance, with developing our simulations for Badlands, the initial ones, it was like every step of the way was like, okay, so what do you want to have in the model? Okay, you want that stuff here. We're gonna draw up some conceptual models. What do you think of these? Okay, well, let's revise the conceptual models. Okay, how about parameterization? We need to use some expert elicitation. So that was like, heavy engagement in developing the science. And it's sort of case specific. But to your sort of the other part of your question around as we, could you sort of, and I don't know if I'm quite capturing it, but could you move away from maybe a more projections or sort of scenario-based approach to a more forecast-based approach? It could be that the skill of our climate models, but ultimately then also our ecological models is such that we could narrow the range of uncertainty enough to move toward a forecast-based approach. But I think that seems, particularly if we're working on the scale of decades, I think that is, I don't see that happening anytime really soon. I think it's always going to be something that, uncertainty is something we're always going to have to deal with. And particularly on the timescales that we're talking about here. Yeah, if you're looking at maybe annual planning efforts, or maybe in the next few years, there's seasonal or sub-seasonal forecasts that could let you really make more focused decisions without a scenario planning approach, no doubt. But for the kind of timescales and geographies we're looking at, I feel like you always want to be considering the broadest plausible range of futures.
Sweet, thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. I'm just looking at the question from John and the John Polo in the chat there, and I can just read it out loud. I know we've got a recording. So are comments or other input from park visitors, users considered in these forecasts? So in my work, we haven't incorporated input from sort of, visitors or other park stakeholders per se. Visitation is something that we sometimes bring into our scenario planning work, because of course that dictates staffing and budgets and so on for parks. And so they do like to think about vegetation and also sort of the combined effects of vegetation and climate change. Visitors have impacts on the resources too, erosion or invasive species or something like that. So in some cases we think about the interactions of non-climate stressors like visitation, but we have not, at least in my work, brought in sort of input per se from visitors or park users. It's been more of a working with the managers themselves. But I know there are people, in fact, maybe folks in the audience who do, this like participatory modeling that might bring in a broader set of stakeholders, but that hasn't been how we've approached it.
Would it be possible to use climate data from a month 2 months, 6 months in advance to constrain the selection of management options or directions that the work would pursue, and that's would allow it to be adjusted every season, basically every year. You know, evaluate that and incorporate those into the modeling so that it gives a more constrained outlook. You know, if precipitation is this and this, or temperatures ranging from here to here, then these are the options that look most available.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. You know, I think then you'd have sort of it would be more of an ecological forecasting type approach. And I know that's an entire field of study where people work to iteratively update, you know, simulations, for instance, to incorporate seasonal or subseasonal forecasts. I know people in the range science world are working on that. You know, on the time scale, you know, of course, then as you get further out into time scales of decades or something, I tend not to incorporate those seasonal forecasts per se, but yeah, I mean, it's that certainly is an active area of work. To ecological forecasting is sort of a big push right now, so that, yeah, folks can anticipate, okay, what's happening this spring, when is bud burst going to happen for a particular species, or you know, how much grass is going to be on our landscape for livestock in the next growing season. But that's sort of operating on timescales that are obviously much shorter. And so, you know, with climate change, we tend to be thinking more in the order of decades. So a bit beyond my area of expertise, but certainly something people are working on.
All right, I have time for one more question, if there's any other questions.
No, it seems like both those timescales are highly relevant, though. You know, that immediate annual prediction, as well as the you know, the decadal and longer timescales, and potentially eventually, you know, having a model that projects all of those would be really an extremely useful feature.
Yeah, I won't argue with that, Stephen. Absolutely, because you know, you think about you know, that balance of near versus long-term objectives, and you know, if you make a near-term decision, are you cutting off longer-term options, or vice versa? So here, yeah, I think.
Yeah, but that's the reality of management, though, right?
Yep.
I mean, you know, you've got to do something this year. So what's their best options this year? And okay, and 10 years down the road, what should we be preparing for? 50 years down the road. You know? Those are the realities that hopefully the modeling will get to. Like, we use a lot of species distribution modeling out here in the Pacific Islands for plants, endangered plants, and we basically take those models and we, you know, overlay them and look at the landscapes that result from stacked, you know, 36 endangered plants. Here's the landscape that sort of is the, you know, the highest value landscape for recovering, you know, all of these plants together, and you know, make these larger landscape maps built on you know, a whole set of species distribution models. And we end up with a landscape assessment that's very interesting when you present it to land managers. You know, they go, wow, that's, you know, that tells me where I can get the most effort out of my dollars by by focusing on targeted landscapes. And they, you know, they really like that, but it still begs the question of, what about this year? You know, what about next year? And we do the climate projections with those same models and show, you know, the you know, how as climate progresses, how these landscapes change and shrink in size for, you know, land areas that are available to support recovery. But you know, and the managers really want to see that kind of information, but ultimately they're going out next week to do something. You know, are they in the right place is sort of a fundamental question for us.
Yeah, no doubt. And yes, I think our ability to track costs and game out those year-to-year decisions is certainly important, and something I think in the invasive species realm we're getting pretty good at.
Yeah, and that's a big focus for a lot of the work we're doing in the CASC network, including myself, about related to prescribed fire. So that's probably a good closing place. Let's and I see John showing back up if he's got any talk.
There was a question about the videos, the recordings. We try to turn those around within 24 hours. Sometimes it takes until Monday, but I posted the link in the chat of, and that was my dog coughing. Posted a link in the chat to where those videos can be found of all of our past forums.
All right, let's all give Brian a clapping you can hear, or visual clapping. Thanks again, Brian.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, and we'll see you next time. Take care.